Welcome to your deep dive into the Federalist Papers. Looks like you've given us a pretty interesting selection of excerpts here, so we're going to help you break down those core arguments and, get a feel for the historical context. Makes these papers so important. You might be prepping for maybe a tough history class or just, curious about how the American government came to be. Either way, we're about to uncover some pretty cool insights into the minds of the Founding Fathers, so let's jump in.
You know, what people often miss is that these papers weren't just like some abstract theories about government, right? They were written in a very specific moment,
Yeah.
a moment of, well, a lot of anxiety and uncertainty in the early days of the U.S.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the excerpts actually mentions anxieties in the 1780s, and I gotta admit, the phrase singular and solemn experiment, that really caught my eye. It's like they weren't totally sure this whole self-government thing was gonna work out. So what events were kind of shaping this unease, this sense of, are we really gonna make it?
Okay, imagine the scene. You've just fought a revolution, declared independence, but now you're faced with this huge task of actually governing yourselves. And the Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at a national government, well, they weren't really working out so well. They were too weak to really address all these challenges facing this new nation. You had economic struggles, disputes between states, and even armed uprisings, like Shays Rebellion.
Shays Rebellion. Now that sounds intense. So fill us in. What happened there?
It was it was a real wake-up call. It showed just how fragile this young republic was. So in Massachusetts, you have these farmers, many of them, veterans of the Revolutionary War, and they're facing debt and foreclosure. And they feel like the state government doesn't care, right?
Yeah.
That it's siding with the wealthy creditors. So what do? They take matters into their own hands. They start disrupting court proceedings, challenging the authority of the state.
Wow, so this wasn't just some local dispute. This had national implications, right?
Oh, absolutely. This thing sent shockwaves through the elite class. They saw it as like a sign, that the whole social fabric was unraveling, that the revolution they had fought, might lead to anarchy, and that fear, that sense of we need to do something. You can really feel it in the Federalist Papers.
Okay, so how did Shays Rebellion, how did that directly shape the arguments we see in the Federalist Papers?
Think of it this way. Shays Rebellion, it became like a powerful talking point for the Federalists, the group that supported this new Constitution. They argued that the rebellion, well, it exposed the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, right? Highlighting the need for a stronger national government, one that could maintain order, protect property rights, and effectively respond to these kinds of crises.
So the Federalist Papers were basically using this real-world example to say, look, this is what happens when you have a weak central government. We need something that can prevent this kind of chaos.
Exactly. And that's a key strategy you see throughout the Federalist Papers. They're not just these, theoretical arguments floating out there. They're grounded in the anxieties and experiences of the time. They use these real-world examples to make their case for this more unified and more, effective national government.
Okay, that makes sense. Now we know the Federalist Papers were written by these three key figures, right? You got Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They were all, united in supporting the Constitution, but I'm guessing they didn't always see eye to eye on every single detail.
I'm catching on quickly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they shared the goal of ratifying the Constitution, for sure. But each of them brought their own perspective, their own vision for this new republic.
Okay, so let's break it down, right? Let's break down these different viewpoints. What made each of these founding fathers, what made them tick?
Okay, picture Hamilton, right? Picture him as this ambitious, energetic visionary. He was really a strong advocate for a strong central government with a powerful executive branch. He saw the U.S., he saw it as this, potential economic and military powerhouse on the world stage.
Got it. So Hamilton was the big picture guy, the one pushing for a nation that could, really compete with the big players, those European powers. Okay, so what about Madison?
Madison, he was often called the father of the Constitution. He was, a bit more cautious, maybe. He shared that, that Federalist goal, but he was also really concerned about the potential for tyranny, even within a republic. He emphasized checks and balances, to prevent any one branch of government from having too much power.
So while Hamilton was all about strength and efficiency, Madison was more concerned with, safeguarding liberty and preventing that concentration of power. What a fascinating dynamic.
Yeah, it really is. And then you've got Jay, who, because he was sick, he contributed fewer essays, but he focused on foreign policy, arguing that a unified nation was essential for navigating the complex world of international relations.
So a bit of a different angle from Jay, really highlighting the need for a united front on that global stage. This is already painting a much more complex picture than that I had before. And speaking of different perspectives, we can't forget the Anti-Federalists, right? One of the excerpts you gave us mentions their concerns about the Senate, potentially becoming like an aristocracy. Was that a legitimate fear, or were they just trying to, stir the pot?
Well, their concerns weren't, totally unfounded. Remember, I mean, the American Revolution, it was in part a rejection of what the colonists saw as this oppressive British aristocracy,
Yeah.
embodied by the unelected House of Lords. So the idea of a Senate, right, chosen by state legislatures rather than directly by the people, that raised some alarm bells for the Anti-Federalists. They saw echoes of that same system they just fought to overthrow.
It sounds like they were worried about, well, about history repeating itself, right? With the new elite class gaining control.
Exactly. They were afraid that this proposed system would just, replace one distant ruling class with another, and that would undermine the very principles of self-government they'd fought so hard for.
Okay, so we've got the Federalists pushing for a stronger national government and the Anti-Federalists pushing back, concerned about potential tyranny. But I'm curious, how did the authors of the Federalist Papers, how did they address these fundamental concerns about human nature? I mean, they were writing at a time when the idea of a government based on the consent of the governed, that was still a pretty radical experiment.
And that's where things get really interesting. The authors of the Federalist Papers, they were deeply influenced by Enlightenment thinkers, but they were also realists. I mean, they weren't naive. They believed that human nature is, well, it's not inherently perfect, right? Yeah. They understood that people are driven by self-interest, and that this could lead to factions and instability.
Yeah, they weren't just some, idealistic dreamers. They knew that any system of government, it has to account for the less than perfect aspects of human nature. That's a really important point.
Exactly. They believe that a well-structured government, it shouldn't ignore self-interest, right? But it should try to, channel it, make it work for the common good. The key, they thought, was to design a system that could harness these individual motivations and prevent them from undermining the stability of the republic.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So how did they propose to do that? What were the specific mechanisms they were pushing for in the Federalist Papers?
One of the most important concepts they emphasized, I think, was the idea of checks and balances. They argue that, dividing power between different branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, they thought that would prevent any one person or group from getting too much power. Each branch would have its own responsibilities and also the ability to limit the power of the others.
Okay, so it's like a three-way tug of war, right? Where each branch is kind of keeping the others in check. But to be honest, I've always found this whole concept of checks and balances, I don't know, it's always seemed a little abstract to me. Can you give us a concrete example of, how this would actually play out in the real world?
Oh, of course. Let's say, for example, Congress, the legislative branch, they want to pass a new law, right? Well, the president, who represents the executive branch, might have concerns about this law and choose to veto it. But then Congress, they can override the president's veto if they have a 2/3 majority vote. Then the judicial branch, through the Supreme Court, can we can review the law, and they can determine if it's constitutional or not.
So even if one branch tries to, kind of overstep its bounds, the other branch, they've got the power to push back, right? It's like a built-in system of accountability.
That's the idea. The authors of the Federalist Papers, they argued that this intricate dance of countervailing powers, this would be the most effective way to prevent tyranny and protect individual liberty. They believe that by diffusing power and by creating, multiple points of kind of resistance, they were making it much harder for any one faction or individual to dominate the whole system.
Okay, so checks and balances, that's a crucial part of their argument. But if I remember correctly, the Federalist Papers, they also dive into some very specific anxieties that people had about, about this proposed constitution. For instance, there's this excerpt here about concerns over the national government, having too much control over the military. It's like they were saying, hey, haven't we just learned our lesson about standing armies?
Yeah, and that fear was, deeply rooted in their historical experience. Remember, one of the major grievances against the British monarchy It was the quartering of British troops in colonial homes without consent. I mean, the colonists, they saw a standing army as this potential tool of oppression, right?
Yeah.
A threat to their liberty.
So it makes sense why the Anti-Federalists would be wary of, of giving the national government too much power over the military. But how did the authors of the Federalist Papers, how did they address this concern?
Well, they didn't try to shy away from it. In fact, Hamilton, in several of his essays, he argues that a standing army, it is essential for national defense, especially given the potential threats from foreign powers and internal unrest.
Yeah.
He uses examples like the vulnerability of the states under the Articles of Confederation, where that lack of a unified military force left them weak and disunited.
So he's acknowledging those historical concerns, but also making this, this practical argument for, the necessity of having a national military force in a dangerous world.
Exactly. But he doesn't stop there. He emphasizes that under the proposed Constitution, control over the military, it wouldn't be solely in the hands of the executive branch. Congress, the branch that's most directly accountable to the people, they would have the power to declare war and to control the funding for the military.
So that's where those checks and balances come in again, right? The legislature has the power to, to kind of rein in the executive branch when it comes to military matters. It's a way to prevent the potential for abuse.
Precisely. It's a prime example of how the Federalist Papers, they're trying to alleviate these fears by showing how the proposed system would actually protect liberty more effectively than that weaker system under the Articles of Confederation.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about this other major criticism of the Constitution? I mean, the lack of a Bill of Rights. That seems like a pretty big oversight. How did they defend leaving that out?
Yeah, that was a huge point of contention during the ratification debates. And, it's something people still debate even today. The Anti-Federalists, they argued that without a Bill of Rights, the national government, it would be free to just trample on individual liberties.
And it seems like a pretty, straightforward argument, right? If you want to protect individual rights, you just list them out, you make it explicit. So what was the counter argument there?
Hamilton, being Hamilton, he took a bit of a contrarian view. He argued in Federalist 84 that a Bill of Rights, it was, unnecessary and maybe even dangerous. He thought that by listing specific rights, you might imply that any rights not specifically mentioned, they weren't protected.
Yeah, I see. It's like saying, okay, well, we've listed the right to free speech, but does that mean the government can restrict other forms of expression that we haven't specifically mentioned? It's a subtle point, but yeah, I could see how that could be a problem.
Exactly. Hamilton, he also pointed out that the Constitution, it already contains safeguards against, government tyranny. Things like the writ of habeas corpus, the prohibition on ex post facto laws, and the guarantee of a trial by jury. He argued that these provisions, combined with the overall structure of the government, they were enough to protect individual liberties.
So he was basically saying, don't worry, the system itself is designed to protect your rights, even without this, this specific list.
Exactly. And this whole debate about, the best way to safeguard individual liberties, I think it really gets to the heart of what makes the Federalist Papers so fascinating. They force us to grapple with these, these fundamental questions, these really big questions about the nature of government, the balance of power, and the meaning of freedom.
It's amazing how these debates from centuries ago, they still feel so relevant today. But let's maybe shift gears a bit and zoom in on something a little more specific. The Federalist Papers, they don't just focus on the big picture, right? They also get into the, the nuts and bolts of how the government should actually work. There's this excerpt here about the mechanics of representation, and I don't know, I'm curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, that's one of the things that makes the Federalist Papers so unique. They're not just like theoretical treatises, They're also practical guides to how this, this proposed Constitution would actually function in the real world.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here. What did they have to say about representation?
Well, remember, no taxation without representation. That was a huge rallying cry during the American Revolution. I mean, the colonists were furious that they were being taxed by a British Parliament where they had no voice, right?
Right. The whole revolution, it was basically sparked by this lack of representation.
Exactly. So the question of how the people would be represented in this new government, I mean, that was absolutely central to the debate over the Constitution.
So how did the Federalist Papers address this?
They spent a lot of time really explaining and defending this proposed system of representation in the House and the Senate. Madison, in particular, goes into great detail in Federalist 52. He argues that the House of Representatives, which was directly elected by the people, with the number of representatives from each state being determined by its population, he argued that this would ensure that the will of the people, it was accurately reflected in the government.
Okay, so this direct connection between the people and their elected representatives, that was seen as essential. That makes sense. But what about the Senate? That was a bit more complicated, right?
You're right. The Senate, it was supposed to be chosen by state legislatures, not directly by the people. So it was a more indirect form of representation, for sure. And it caused a lot of debate.
I bet. It seems like it would be, less democratic. So how did they justify this system?
The authors of the Federalist Papers, they argued that the Senate, it served a different purpose than the House.
Mm-hmm.
They saw it as a check on the potential, I guess you could say, excesses of the House,
Yeah.
right? A body that would be more deliberative and less susceptible to just the whims of public opinion.
Mm.
They also argued that the Senate, it was necessary to kind of balance the interests of the states with the interests of the nation as a whole.
So it was about creating a system where both the people and the states, they both had a voice, a kind of balancing act between like direct democracy and federalism.
That's a great way to put it. And this tension, this tension between the national and state governments, this need to find the right balance of power, that's something you see throughout the Federalist Papers.
Okay, that's making a lot more sense now. But there's one more thing I wanted to ask about. In several of the excerpts, the authors, they seem really concerned about the dangers of factions. What exactly did they mean by that?
Factions. Yeah, that's one of the most insightful and honestly kind of chilling concepts you see in the Federalist Papers, and it's so relevant, to our own political climate today.
Mm.
I mean, they knew, right?
Yeah.
They recognized that factions, they're an inevitable part of any free society.
Okay, so before we go any further, can you define what they meant by faction? It seems like it has a specific meaning here.
Yeah, it does. In Federalist 10, Madison, he defines a faction as, and I'm quoting here, a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community.
So it's not just any group of people, right? It's a group that's driven by this shared interest or passion that could potentially, harm the rights of others or the well-being of the community as a whole. That's pretty insightful.
It is. And they were worried that factions, if they weren't, kept in check, they could really tear the Republic apart. They saw factions as a threat to liberty and to effective governance.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm starting to see why they were so worried about this. But if factions are inevitable in a free society, like they argued, then how do you design a system that can handle them, that can withstand this potentially destructive influence?
That's the $1 million question, right?
Yeah.
And the Federalist Papers, they offer a number of solutions. One of their most important arguments is that a large and diverse republic, it's actually better equipped to handle factions than a small homogenous one.
Really, that's kind of counterintuitive. Why would a larger and more diverse republic be better at dealing with factions?
Think about it this way. In a small republic, it'd be much easier for a single faction to kind of gain control and impose its will on everyone else, right?
Mm.
But in a large republic with a wider range of interests and opinions, it would be much harder for any one faction to become, dominant.
So it's like the idea that, in a diverse ecosystem, different species, they kind of keep each other in check. No one species can just, completely take over because there's always competition. Is that kind of what they were getting at?
That's a great analogy. They believe that the sheer size and diversity of the United States, it would act as a safeguard against the dangers of factionalism. They argued that with so many different interests and perspectives, all competing for influence, it'd be really difficult for any one faction to gain a tyrannical hold on power.
Okay, so the size and diversity of the republic, that's one solution. What other mechanisms did they propose?
They also emphasized, the importance of a representative system of government instead of having, every single citizen directly involved in decision-making, which, could lead to chaos and mob rule. They argued for a system where where elected representatives, they would act as, as filters, refining and moderating the passions of the people.
So it's not just about pure democracy, right? It's about having, elected officials who can make decisions based on reason and deliberation rather than, being swayed by the immediate whims of the crowd.
Exactly. They believe that a well-structured representative system, could help to kind of channel that energy of factions in a more constructive direction. And they also emphasize the importance of a strong and independent judiciary, capable of upholding the rule of law and protecting the rights of individuals, even when those rights might be, threatened by the passions of the majority.
It sounds like they were really trying to build a system that was, resilient, something that could withstand these inevitable pressures and divisions that just come up in any society.
That's one of the most impressive things about the Federalist Papers, I think. They weren't just trying to create a government that would work in the short term. They were thinking about the long game, the long-term stability and health of this republic. They were trying to design a system that could adapt and endure, even in the face of all these challenges.
It's incredible how they were able to anticipate so many of the challenges that democracies face, even today. But we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the historical context of the Federalist Papers, delved into the anxieties of the time, unpacked these key concepts like checks and balances, and even tackled these really thorny issues of factions and the balance of power.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
That's right. There's always more to explore, more layers to uncover. But I think we've given our listener a solid foundation for their own deep dive into the Federalist Papers.
Absolutely. And hopefully we've sparked their curiosity and inspired them to keep digging.
As we've been, talking about all these anxieties and the solutions they propose in the Federalist Papers, it's striking, right, how much they were really grappling with this balance between individual liberty and the need for a strong and effective government. And that tension, it's still so relevant today.
It really is. And you can see how they try to navigate that tension in their discussions of, specific powers, the powers that are granted to the national government. For instance, one of the excerpts you sent, it touches on the power to tax. And if you remember, that was a major sticking point under the Articles of Confederation.
Oh, totally. I mean, the inability of the national government to effectively collect taxes, that was a recipe for disaster, right? I mean, it left them constantly broke, basically, and unable to do their job. But giving the national government the power to tax directly, that must have been a really tough sell.
It was. I mean, a lot of people, they feared that a powerful national government, one that could levy taxes, it would become, tyrannical and oppressive, just like the British monarchy they just fought to get rid of.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how did the Federalist Papers address those fears? How did they get people on board with this?
Well, they argued that the power to tax, it was essential, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely essential for the survival and success of the nation. They pointed to the financial chaos of the 1780s, the inability to pay debts, the worthless paper money, all that stuff. And they said, look, this is evidence, right? This shows that the existing system, it just wasn't working.
It's like they were saying, we can either give the national government the tools it needs to function, or we can just watch this whole experiment just fall apart.
Exactly. And they were careful to explain how this proposed system, it would prevent abuse. They emphasize that the power to tax, it would reside with Congress,
right?
The branch of government that's most directly accountable to the people.
Right. There's that principle of representation again. They're saying basically that the people, through their their elected representatives, they would have control over
Right.
the money.
Precisely. Yeah. And they also pointed out that the Constitution, it actually places limits on the types of taxes that could be levied.
Yeah.
And that all tax bills, they would have to originate in the House of Representatives, right? The chamber that's closest to the people.
Okay, so it's not just like a blank check. There are like these built-in safeguards, right? To prevent the government from just, going crazy and abusing this power to tax.
Right, exactly. And you see this same kind of careful reasoning throughout the Federalist Papers. They go into all these different specific powers, the powers that are granted to the national government. Everything from regulating commerce to to establishing a national currency to, providing for the common defense.
So it's really like a deep dive into the practicalities, right? The practicalities of how this new government would actually work. They weren't just focused on these abstract principles. They were trying to actually anticipate and address these very real challenges that a new nation would face.
Exactly. And as you read through these excerpts, I'd encourage you to pay attention to how they connect those practical challenges back to the broader principles that they're advocating for.
Yeah, and I'm noticing a pattern here. It seems like every time they address a specific concern, they always link it back to those core themes like balance, representation, and this need for a government that's both effective and accountable.
Yeah. You're picking up on one of the key strategies of the Federalist Papers. They're not just, giving you a list of arguments. They're weaving this coherent vision, right? A vision of how this new system of government, how it would function, how it would address the anxieties of the time, and how it would ultimately secure the blessings of liberty for themselves and for their posterity.
That's powerful. And speaking of, connecting the past to the present, there's something that I've been thinking about. As we've been discussing these ideas, we've talked about the historical context, the anxieties of the 1780s, the concerns about factions, and all these debates over the specific powers of the government. But what I find, I don't know, maybe most fascinating is how these debates they're still so relevant today.
Oh, absolutely. The questions they were grappling with, right? This whole question of the balance of power, the role of government, the nature of individual liberty. These are timeless questions. Every generation has to wrestle with these.
Yeah.
And the Federalist Papers, they give us this framework for thinking about these challenges.
It's like they've given us this set of tools, right? A set of tools for analyzing and debating these huge issues that we face as a society.
Exactly. They offer us a language, a vocabulary, for engaging in these crucial conversations.
So as our listener, as they continue their deep dive into the Federalist Papers, what would you encourage them to keep in mind? What questions should they be asking themselves, as they read these texts?
I would say I would encourage them to think about how the arguments that are presented in the Federalist Papers, how they resonate with issues and debates that are happening right now today. Like how do the concerns about factions, how do those play out in our current political climate? How do we balance the need for national security with the protection of individual liberties in a world that's so different, right? It's so different from the one that the founding fathers they lived in. What lessons can we draw from their approach to constitutional design as we try to tackle the challenges that are facing our own democracy?
Those are some really great questions, and I think they really get to the heart of what makes the Federalist Papers so enduringly relevant. They're not just these historical documents, they're invitations, right? Invitations to engage in this conversation, this ongoing conversation about the fundamental principles that underpin our system of government and our society as a whole.
And that conversation, it's ongoing. It's a conversation that each generation has to have anew.
Well said. I think we've given our listener a lot to think about. We've explored the historical context of the Federalist Papers. We delved into the anxieties of the time, unpacked key concepts like checks and balances, tackled these thorny issues of factions and the balance of power. What stood out to you as we went through these excerpts? What sparked your curiosity? What aspects of the Federalist Papers do you think are, maybe most relevant to the challenges that we face as a society today? That's something to ponder, as you continue your own deep dive into this really remarkable document. Until next time.